Okay, so welcome to our lunch study today. We are going to be beginning a study of Rabbi Mordecai Kaplan. Here is a picture of Rabbi Kaplan, and he's an interesting figure, lived into his hundreds, lived into the 1980s, a long time mover and shaker in American Jewry. He began as a sociologist and a midrash teacher at the Jewish Theological Seminary, and he founded what has come to be known as Reconstructionist Judaism. I think it's now called Reconstructing Judaism is the movement that he started. And I wanted to begin because he's really interesting when he talks about notions of God. And on his theology, it's been coming up from time and time again in the midst of our conversations. And I think he's one of the most influential thinkers of the 20th century because so much of what we've come to know as American Judaism comes from Rabbi Kaplan. The shul with the pool, the JCC movements, the camping movements, Judaism as a civilization that takes in all aspects of culture. Really comes from Rabbi Kaplan. And so what we want to understand is where does he come down theologically and what ultimately led to a separation between him and the conservative movement. And then we want to just look at some of these issues because I know as we've been talking about theology and God, some of you in this conversation have been pushing back on the notions of a commander that has certain commandments for you to fulfill. Well, that was something that also Rabbi Kaplan struggled with. And so I'm going to take a little selection of his book today, which is Questions Jews Ask. And we're going to read through some of the Q&A, have a little conversation about it. But I want to begin, we're very fortunate. I have here with me a little audio from Rabbi Kaplan himself. And I thought it might be nice to hear from the man himself about what he thinks about God. So does everybody see the picture? Can you see Kaplan's picture?
No.
No, what do you see at the moment?
I see an image of a tape starter.
Okay, so I guess we're gonna have to go with that image. So let's just listen and try to turn your volume up so you can hear. At one point he cuts out, but I think you should get this. He's gonna be introduced by his biographer, who is Mel Skolt. And I have to make sure that I share this the right way. Sandy Edwards told me how to do this. Okay.
This is a recording of Mordechai Kaplan.
Can we hear?
Giving a speech around 1960 or so. So he would have been 80 years old. He was giving a speech at the Park Avenue Synagogue on the anniversary of the death of Milton Steinberg, who had been rabbi at the Park Avenue Synagogue. And he makes a statement here about belief in God and what that should mean and the way in which the belief in God should function, which is related primarily to our experience rather than to some metaphysical entity. Kaplan throughout his life rejected the idea of a supernatural God, and here he tries to explain what his belief is.
In the first place, God should mean to us the loyalty and love for the social body, society, or people we belong to. It is not the question of what God is, but what should God mean in terms of experience, of feeling. And the answer is, in terms of feeling, it should mean love and loyalty for our Jewish people. Loyalty and love for our Jewish people can help to make us fully human in the best sense of that term. And for that reason, such emotion and such love is divine, is an experience of divinity. Secondly, God should mean to us the sense of moral responsibility. Its emotional value derives from the feeling of human dignity implied in being treated as a person The feeling of responsibility is an experience of holiness, because when we are made to feel that we are responsible, we are credited with the dignity of being human, with the freedom and the right to choose among alternatives that which makes life worthwhile. It is thus a manifestation of divinity in human life. Thirdly, God should mean to us, and this is what our ideology emphasizes, never mind the question of ultimate reality of God. What should God mean to us in our experience? Namely, the normal want to be whole and integrated mentally and morally with ourselves and our fellow men. Integrity is thus a manifestation of divinity. Honesty.
So that's where the clip cuts. The clip cuts off there. Sorry to cut the clip off at that moment, but that's the extent of the clip that I have. And I wanted to just, what I wanted to do, I still haven't figured it out, is I wanted you to see this photo so you could see what he looks like. And that's probably from around 1960, if I had to guess. And there he is. So let me stop the share. And first of all, quite dramatic hearing Rabbi Kaplan's voice. I don't know if people have met him or had the chance to hear him speak. So I'm just curious to know, what did you think of him? What did you think of him as an orator? What did you think of his message? Sandy, you've got a big smile on your face. Yeah.
I just never thought of him with an accent.
With an accent? Why not? Of course.
No, I should have known. It was the accent
that threw you off. Well, because he's so American. I mean, he's like the quintessential American rabbi, that to hear him with a thick accent is a little disorienting. But Meryl, yes.
Okay, so I actually had the honor of meeting him on two separate occasions. On one occasion, my husband, your father, Stuart, was interviewing him, and we rode in a limo with him. Prior to that, my mother's first cousin, Rabbi Arthur Zuckerman, was actually one of his first disciples and belonged to the SAJ, Society for the Advancement of Judaism. And when my cousin had, he was the Hillel director at CCNY, City College of New York. They had, I think it was the 25th anniversary or something like that of his being there. Rabbi Kaplan was the guest speaker. So I'm very interested in this conversation, and I'm particularly interested in, because I used to go on around and round and round with my cousin about what does it mean not to believe in a personal God. And you know what? This actually answered it for me much better than any of the discussions that I've had forever.
Well, okay, interesting. Other thoughts? Anybody else? Marv, what did you think?
Well, it seems like he's saying, do the attributes of God. I keep referring to this. In Ki Tisa, Moses asks God to show me your ways. And the ways that God shows Moses are the 13 attributes of God. So forget about God, just do the attributes. And his speech had a number of the attributes that he's telling us.
Be moral. What is godliness? What does God mean? God means us being good. God is the power that makes for salvation. To the extent that we are good and moral, that is the extent that we are godly. People like this, people not like this. This is just a taste. This is just a little, we're going to wade into he lived a long life and he wrote a lot. So this is just the little taste. Any other thoughts before we get into some of his Q&A? All right, let's open it up to, so he has this wonderful book called Questions Jews Ask, which is very readable. And I'm guessing it's still in print. If I had to guess, it's still in print. Hold on. Let me pause. Okay, here it is. Now let me share. And let's go through some of these questions, which are exactly on this topic. All right. Here we go. Let's begin. I've got 9 pages of this. We might not get through all the questions. We can certainly continue the conversation. But let's see how we feel about Kaplan's answers when it comes to God. So first question is, does the denial of the supernatural preclude the belief in God? All right, so does just saying that there is nothing supernatural, does that mean that we don't believe in God? So he says here, our conception of God cannot but be determined by our idea of the physical world, as well as by our idea of human nature and the human mind. As imperfect as our knowledge of these is, it is much more extensive and more correct than that achieved by our forefathers. Other things being equal, a conception of God based on modern knowledge of reality is bound to be nearer the truth than is the traditional conception. Okay. All right, you might want to disagree with that, but he says, well, we know more now, we're smarter now. He clearly believes in a notion of progress. God is the power that makes for salvation, implies inevitably, I guess, we're progressing towards that salvation. So he's saying our conceptions of God are going to be much more meaningful than older ones. With their limited knowledge of reality, the ancients regarded miracles or occasions for suspending the laws of nature, not only as possible, but as necessary means to experience the reality of God. On the other hand, modern men cannot help but regard the suspension of natural law as unsubstantiated. More than that, he cannot, with his present knowledge of reality, find in such a conception of God the support he requires to face life with an attitude of responsibility, humility, and fortitude. All right, he seems pretty certain of that. The above question implies that it is for the modern-minded man to defend his use of the name God in designating the reality on which he relies for such support. Actually, the burden of proof belongs on the traditionalist who subscribes to modern astrology, geology, and psychology. It is he who has to justify his use of the term God in a sense that is wholly in conflict with what he himself believes about the world and the nature of the human mind. He says, look, I have no such problem. I have no cognitive dissonance. It's the traditional person who clearly lives with a tremendous cognitive dissonance because he follows the rules of the world. At the same time, he has this unrealistic notion of God. All right, so what do we think about that first answer? Is that an answer? Is that a non-answer? Is he playing semantics here? What, Ben Chin?
I really admire his chutzpah.
Why is that?
Well, because he turns the traditional view on its head, right? The traditional view, at least a traditional view, is that the further away you get from the Torah, right, the shakier your epistemological ground is, right?
Farther away from Sinai. That's right. Farther away from Sinai.
And he turns that on its head. He says, no, of course we know much more now than we did then. So the closer you get to now, the more confidence you can have in what you know. And so that, I think, is just amazingly audacious. And also, his point of saying, no, the burden of proof isn't on me to say how my views, accord with the tradition. The burden of proof is on the traditionalist.
What about this line here? What about this line here? Modern men cannot help but regard the suspension of natural laws unsubstantiated. He cannot, with his present knowledge of reality, find in such a conception of God the support he requires to face life with an attitude of responsibility, humility, and fortitude. That feels like a critique.
Of what?
Me. Because I face life with a rather strong theological sort of bent, as do a lot of Jews who pray to God on a regular basis. And I feel like I can do that with an attitude of responsibility, humility, and fortitude.
I don't think he's arguing against God. I don't think he's arguing. I certainly don't think he's arguing against prayer or practice, right? I don't see that here at all.
No, he's arguing against the supernatural notion of God.
Right. He's saying what he's arguing about is a point of view that like you said, creates the kind of cognitive dissonance that you have to have if you accept, all the
Gravity.
benefits
You accept gravity if you accept germs.
modern
Right.
knowledge, and then sort of carve out a piece of your understanding of the world that says, well, yeah, that operates in, over here, but when it comes to things that are deepest and most, important to me, then those things no longer apply.
Yeah, he definitely has a critique to an Orthodox background, Torah Umada, right? The old YU motto, Torah and science. He's definitely pointing to the dissonance that's required. Stuart Bletcher.
Yeah, he's misusing, or he's using the term very loosely, natural law. And I only recently heard Martin Amos, who's very secular, not religious at all, a brilliant writer, talk about God. And the term natural law suggests that we could look up in the sky and we could look at one of our rocket ships trying to go to Mars, and we can say, well, I know what natural law is, and I know exactly what that rocket is going to experience as it goes 100 million light years away from Earth. And I know exactly, how gravity will operate up there, and I know how cold it's going to be. I know everything about natural law. And what Amos said, which really stuck with me, and I only heard it recently, he said, well, as long as I look up at the stars and I consider the cosmos and I realize all of the things that we don't know about the universe, until we have answers about all the things we don't know about the universe, I cannot deny the existence of God.
Right.
I thought that was very profound and very thoughtful.
Thank you, Stuart.
That's a God of the gaps, right?
I didn't hear what you said.
He says that's the God who exists in the gaps between our knowledge.
Right.
Well, that's what an agnostic is.
Right, but that's problematic, right? Because that means as our knowledge grows, the space for God just inevitably gets smaller and smaller and smaller. Is that a universe you want to live in? It's not one I want to live in.
Well, maybe as our knowledge grows, our capacity, we might just learn that instead of one dimension where we feel we have space for, there might be 9 dimensions. And so then our knowledge grows and the capacity of our knowledge is just much larger than we thought from the outset. Stuart Ellison.
Thank you. I have a little different interpretation of this. I don't think it's that radical. I think what he means by natural law is the common everyday experience of ordinary people. And I think modern religion, in order to be relevant to the times, I think what he's saying is you have to relate it to the experience of everyday people. If you take music as an example, you could go back to the Al Jolson story that he eschewed traditionalism, and Jolson actually thought his songs were more like prayers. Or today, what you do in the service, having vocal percussionists or people playing various musical instruments would not have been done years ago. And it goes beyond that. I think to use an example of someone also that was not observant at all, my father, he believed that the basis of religion was exactly what the rabbi was talking about: honesty, integrity, morality.
Morality,
So
be a good person. That's right.
I don't think it's all that radical. Maybe the radical part comes in throwing tradition totally away, which I believe would be a mistake.
Yeah, well, he seems to be a little chutzpahdik in this regard. Marcia Glantz?
I think the beauty of Kaplan is I think the beauty of Kaplan is he addresses two issues that are really important, at least to me. One is why bad things happen to good people. If there's this omnipresent God, I mean, why? And the other one is, I don't know who said this, but God exists where people let him in or let God in. In other words, your actions incorporating the attributes of God in your own actions, not just what you say your beliefs are, is where God is, not some outside force that has control over you, but you're really a partner.
All right, so then he goes directly to ask you this question here, Marcia. Here's the next question. So does not the concept of God as the power that makes for salvation imply a human-centered view of the universe? So just like you said, God is where we let God in. So if God is where we let God in, the question comes up, isn't that just human-centric? Then you're just making a man-centric faith. So not more so than any other conception. Is Kaplan's answer. All human thinking, no matter how abstract and universal, can be done only in terms of human experience. The way the world looks to us depends on the length of the light waves to which our eyes can respond. If they could be similarly situated to respond to ultraviolet or infrared waves, the world would look quite different for us. Similarly, our ears are sensitive only to certain vibrations. Even our most abstract ideas, except those of time, space, and causality, which are built into the very structure of our minds, are all derived from interpretation of sense data. And we are conditioned by that. So human needs determine all our inquiries. So why should this be any different? And so then the next question is, I'll get to you just one second, Meryl. I want to ask this question first, because I just want to follow up with this. Did God create man, or did man, as the expression of his highest intellectual and spiritual feelings, create God? Okay, so he's trying to figure this out. It's a whole bunch of questions that Kaplan has been asked for a long time, and he answers one way, but he's also including all of the different ways that the question can be asked. And here's a pretty direct question. Did we create God, or did God create us? So here's his answer. Although to those of us who are sensitive to religious values, this question sounds crude and blasphemous. We quote it here because that is the form in which it is frequently posed. The question, however, cannot be answered in the form presented because it is evident that the questioner has no clearly defined idea of the meaning of create. We therefore paraphrase the question as follows. Is God as real as the world around us? Or is he merely an object of the imagination by which we expressed our highest intellectual and spiritual values? This is a logical and legitimate question. The answer to the question is that God is, in a sense, even more real than the world. Strange as that may sound, we cannot, when we analyze what we mean by reality, come to any other conclusion. If we mean no more by real than the opposite of illusory, then God is at least as real as the world. As directly experienced, the earth seems flat and the sun seems to rise in the east and set in the west. But we know well that these appearances are illusion and not reality. Therefore, if by real we imply having meaning for us, then God is even more real than the world, for God is whatever gives meaning to the world. Let's say that again. Therefore, if by real we imply having meaning for us, then God is even more real than the world, for God is whatever gives meaning to the world. It is only as we discern orderliness and sources of help to human life and the complex of things seen, heard, and felt that we discover a world and nature. Therefore, whether we are aware of God or not, it is because there is a God that we can conceive of a world. The same God who makes the world possible as a world is the God who elicits from us the intellectual and spiritual values that render our life human. Thus, the same God that is the power that makes for world order is the power that makes for human salvation. Okay. Who wants to try to explain that? Meryl Ain.
Okay, I don't know if I can explain that, but this is how I see the whole thing, and as I said, I've been pondering it for many years. So I want to talk about his notion of God and then his notion of Judaism. So, as I said, what I understood from many dialogues with Reconstructionist people was that Kaplan didn't say he didn't believe in God. He didn't believe in a personal God. He did not believe in an anthropomorphic God. But there could be forces, or whatever you want to call it, out there that we just couldn't possibly understand. All we could understand was our, how we live our life in relation to each other. Now, does that mean that you can't pray to personal God if you feel it? I'm not going to answer that. The other thing that I think makes total sense to me is that he sees Judaism, he calls it as a civilization. So why are we kosher? Why do we observe Shabbat? Why do we observe Pesach? Not because a personal God told us to do it, but because as Jews, this is what Jews do. So I don't think
the
he
question's
says there's
irrelevant.
no force out there.
We
He said
create
we
God.
can't possibly understand it. We can only understand it through our interactions with each other.
Okay, so the question exists, but we can't really get at it. And what matters most is how we treat each other, how we behave, how we maintain our tradition, how we keep respect and honor for those who came before us, and how we take care of those who will come in future generations. And this other stuff, did we make God or did God make us? I mean, this is just like having a debate over how many angels fit on the top of a pin. Do people disagree with that? People agree with that? People disagree with that? Anybody want to unpack this really challenging sort of, Ben Chin, did you understand? Could you follow him here? I was really hoping you'd chime in here, because I had a hard time with this paragraph right here.
In short, no.
Oh, you couldn't follow it either.
I don't get, I think what he's saying is that God is the thing that makes meaning. And therefore, since everything in the world, as we experience it, is filtered through how we make meaning of it, of course, that is as real as anything else. I think that's what he's saying, but I'm not quite sure.
Yeah, so I feel like that's right. God is real because look at all the impact that this idea or notion of God has had on human history. Look what it has caused. Therefore, God is more real than anything else. But I like the question that was just raised, that Merrill raises. Can you pray? What about prayer? If prayer is so central to who we are as Jews, then what exactly are we praying to when we say Baruch Atah Adonai? Blessed are you, Lord our God. What are we doing there? What's that all about? Stuart Fletcher.
Going back to the previous question you asked about, what he's saying, I have to think that he was speaking at a time when philosophers, were talking about reality, and there was a lot of talk about reality. And I think Mordechai Kaplan, was caught up in that philosophical milieu, and he was talking in what you just read extensively about the world and reality. And he didn't go into it as the philosophers of the time were going into it, but he went into it in terms of using that as a bridge to dealing with the concept of God. And I think really, what he was saying is, hey, your reality is what you think it is. And if you think there was an intelligent being that put you in your mom's womb and you gave birth and she gave birth, great, that's your reality. So I think he was kind of, going back to what Merrill was saying, she didn't say he was playing games with words, but I think she was pointing out that his disciples, try to give meaning to what he was saying. And that's all we could do, is try and give meaning to what he's saying.
Yeah, I just find it as an unsatisfactory answer to the question. I get that he thinks the question is crude and blasphemous, but if someone said, did we create God or did God create us? And then I got that, I don't know if I would find that particularly satisfactory as an answer. Let's go to another question here, because I think if we think about God as the process that makes for salvation, this was the question I posted up on Facebook. You often state that God should be conceived as a cosmic process rather than as an entity or a being. If God is a process, here it is. How can we pray to him? All right, so let's see. Well, this answer is long. So the conception of God as cosmic process has been subjected to considerable misunderstandings and misplaced restatement, as though it constituted a complete break with the traditional or conventional idea of God. Not only has its validity or truth been attacked, but its very claim to being religious in character and compatible with prayer and worship has been challenged. I think that's what we've been doing here. Many an ill-informed critic has even charged that conception with being atheistic. I mean, yes, for sure. Without entering into a detailed and difficult analysis of the possibility of knowing what God is and how he acts, let the reader consider the case of Maimonides. No one in his senses can question Maimonides' genuine piety and belief in God or the greatness of his mind or character. To whichever of his writings we turn, we find that he keeps on repeating that God and his attributes are one. He goes on to explain that statement as follows. We see Kaplan here quoting the Rambam. When, for example, we are told that God is living, we should not take that to mean that God is a being who possesses the attributes of life, which he shares with other living beings, but that he is life itself. God and life are one in the same. Maimonides' point is that if you say God is living, then you're just giving him an attribute that we know applies to human beings. And so in essence, you're anthropomorphizing him. But here, Maimonides wants to say that God and life are one in the same. Likewise, when we are told that God is good, we should realize that God and goodness are one and the same. Or when God is said to know all things, we should understand that to mean that God and knowledge are identical. For in the case of God, the knower, the act of knowing, and the object are one and the same. All right, so the knower, the act of knowing, and the object are one and the same. Nor was Maimonides the first or the last to affirm that fact about God. Certainly, he was following on the heels of Aristotle. Many other religious thinkers before him and after him affirmed the same about God. What are life, knowledge, goodness, if not processes? They are certainly not beings or entities. Since God is life, knowledge, goodness, what else can he be but process? Notice he hasn't really answered the prayer question yet. Modern scientific and philosophical thought regards all reality not as something static, but as energy in action. When we say that God is process, we select out of the infinite processes in the universe that complex of forces and relationships which makes for the highest fulfillment of man as a human being, and identify it by the term God. I think that's about as clear as you'll ever come to Kaplan saying what God is. I'll read it again. When we say that God is process, we select out of the infinite processes in the universe that complex of forces and relationships which makes for the highest fulfillment of man as a human being, and identify it by the term God. So what is the highest complex? It is whatever that makes for the highest fulfillment of man as a human being. So what is God? God is that which makes for us ultimately to find our highest fulfillment as humans. Okay. In exactly the same way, we select among all the forces and relationships that enter into the life of the individual, those which make for his highest fulfillment, and identify them by the term person. God and person are thus co-relative terms, the meaning of each being relative to and dependent on the other, like parent and child, teacher and pupil. God is the process by which the universe produces persons, and persons are the processes by which God is manifest in the individual. It kind of lost me there. Neither term has meaning without the other. So to conceive of God is to regard him as personal in the sense that he manifests himself in our personality, in every effort of ours to live up to our responsibilities as human beings. In the light of this understanding of the correlation of the human being and God, we can understand prayer. Prayer aims at deriving from the process that constitutes God, which is the process that leads us to be most and highest human, the power that would strengthen the forces of relationships by which we fulfill ourselves as persons. We cannot help being aware of our dependence on the process, which we identify as God, namely on all that makes for goodness, truth, and beauty in the world, but our success in achieving a mature, effective, and well-adjusted personality. And we naturally articulate that need in prayer. I'll stop there because that was a mouthful. Everyone catch that? Did you get that? What is God? God is whatever leads to highest human fulfillment in our humanity, that complex of actions and motivation, whatever that might be, that is godly. If it leads to our highest fulfillment in our humanness. And what is prayer? Prayer is the opportunity for us to remind ourselves of those complexes that are needed for us to be most human. Ben Chen.
So I think maybe it might be worth stepping back in terms of what you're talking about with prayer, right? To say, well, what does prayer mean if you do believe in a supernatural God? Because we haven't answered that question, right? That might be a maybe interesting and easier question, but maybe not as simple as we think. And I think if you can answer that question, then it's much easier to answer the question of what does it mean if you believe in a God that is not supernatural.
That's fine. I take that. That's all well and good. But we have to reconstruct Judaism. We have to build it back up. This was not deconstruct Judaism. This was reconstruct Judaism. And so, pointing out the flaws in the traditionalist approach does not move his movement forward.
No, but you need to know what it is you're reconstructing, right? So if you want to reconstruct prayer, what is it? And what does it do? And what is it for? Right? I think you have to answer that question if you want to be able to reconstruct it or apply it to a different conception of God. And I don't think we've answered that question. I mean, I don't know that that's a given that we know the answer to that question.
Substitute for sacrifices, perhaps? We were commanded to give sacrifices, and this is the substitution for the sacrifices that God calls upon us to
So
give.
is it just petitionary? Is that it?
It's going to depend which rabbi you ask. Right.
But I think there is an answer that says no. It's not just petition. In fact, on Shabbat, it's never petition. Right. So if it's not that, then what is it? Right. I think there's a part of it that has to do with, Yet Gadol V'Yet Kadash, right? To magnify and sanctify the name of God. And if that's what it's about, it doesn't matter if it's a supernatural God, if it's a non-supernatural God, if it's a process, if it's a person, you can do that just as well, no matter what the object is.
Okay. Those people who find, what are other people here? There are a lot of people who haven't heard from yet. Does this notion of prayer to a God process that is the complex of the highest fulfillment of humanity, or do you have a different notion of a God who is listening to your prayers? I'm curious from some of the people I haven't heard from yet. I don't want to call on Susan or Laurel or Stephanie, but you're welcome to chime in, or Ellen or Sandra. Yeah, Susan? No, Susan, no. Sandra, yeah. I can't hear you. Yeah, your sound is off, unfortunately. No, we can't. Type in your question, Sandra.
Right. I have a question.
There it is. I got you now.
Okay. Well, I think of it as a wish when we pray to God. It's not propitiatory, if there is a God or if there isn't, if God is not a being, if God is a force or a process, it's a wish that God does these things, be good, be all good, or all knowledgeable. As you say, God is these things that you enumerated.
Yeah. Yeah. Blessed are you, God. Bert, what do you think?
Well, I think, I mean, it seems to be fairly obvious. He's trying to make God and religion meaningful to a scientifically oriented generation. However, maybe since then, he's doing it to a generation or to people who have tremendous faith in science and that has all the answers. I think now, I mean, again, just speaking for me, especially now with what's going on, I don't think science has all the answers. And maybe going back to a supernatural God is not a bad thing. I mean, like, you can't prove it, but then you can't prove it's not. And I mean, he reminds me, not that I really understand either one, but I mean, Einstein did not believe in a personal God, but he also said God does not play dice with the universe. And that seems to be, again, if you lose your faith in science, your faith in traditional or modern traditional religion comes back. And that's sort of the way I see it. I think he was a good man for his time. He has a lot of good ideas, but he has this tremendous faith in science that he may have lost in traditional religion.
Thank you. This is an emotional, not an emotionable, not an intellectual one. What did you mean by that, Randy? You can keep writing, Randy. Someone else had a hand up? Did someone else have their hand up? Stephanie.
Yeah, I'm not really sure. I'm a scientist and I'm having a really hard time. So for example, what Stuart said, so basically I just like thought of this when you said, like, if you want to believe that imaginary creature put you in your mother's womb, that becomes your reality. I don't know how I feel about that, because as a scientist, I mean, I definitely agree that science does not have all the answers. And for these parts that we don't have the answers, I think it is understandable to try to make sense of it by believing, and I think that's very important. But when it comes to like facts, like conception, for example, where like for me that is a fact, and then it's like there's other facts that was just like an example, and it's really hard for me to think you can just think of a different explanation and just believe in it. And for me, that it's hard to say that that becomes reality or the truth, you know?
Yeah, I mean, it's a construct for the most part. But I mean, do you find meaning in his sort of theological framework here? So this is, you know, we're studying, you're in my classes, you know, we're studying different perspectives on Judaism. I mean, how does this one strike you?
I can relate. I mean, definitely. I think it comes back to, I think what Bert said, it's like, we don't have all the answers with science. And I feel it's really important for people to, like, it's the same for me. It's like I try to make sense for stuff that I don't understand, and maybe at some point we will understand, but for now I think that's just very important to move forward.
Okay, thank you. Other thought, Ellen?
I don't have answers for this whole question, but there's a part of the way that Kaplan talks that kind of leaves me wanting. And I think for me, God is the awesomeness of the universe. And that for me is like inconceivable. Maybe one day we'll be able to understand it. But I kind of see it like the blind man and the elephant. One sees the trunk, the other sees the tail. And we often think we have such a terrific understanding of all of this stuff. And certainly in the space of time, we have a better understanding than ever before. But I still think there is so much that we don't understand, and I have a great reverence for that.
What's prayer, Ellen?
I think prayer is a lot of things. I think prayer is hope sometimes. I think prayer is gratitude sometimes. I think prayer motivates me to have enough faith to keep going and to deal with things when my experience of the world is rocky. I'm sure there are a number of other elements of it to me.
Thank you.
But I don't think of prayer as
a telephone call. As a telephone call.
Convinced to do something on my behalf.
Right. Thank you. Marcia Glantz.
I think one of the things that I find interesting with him, and maybe no one else sees this, but when he talks about prayer, it seems to me it's sort of a segue or a pathway to see meditation as prayer. This whole idea of when you meditate, you're not meditating to a God. It's introspection. It's maybe seeing how I want to. Just like Ellen was saying, why you pray? Well, when you meditate, there's the opportunity to acknowledge that you're not the center of the universe, or I'm not the center of the universe. I shouldn't speak for others. That it's a striving with that introspection. And it's not this feeling that, right, there are circumstances under which I don't seem to have control, but it doesn't necessarily mean that there's a God that is using me like a chess piece and moving me around.
Marcia, I think that's exactly right. I mean, I think that's exactly how he perceives of it. And he was very much a fan of the Transcendentalists. He would pray from Emerson or Matthew Arnold. And I think they speak quite beautifully to this sort of meditative sort of connection to the whole that he was trying to achieve via prayer. So I think you're exactly right where Kaplan was coming from. So I want to get to these two here, but in what terms can we address God? We cannot do so, right? I think even Stephanie, we can't address God in terms of scientific or philosophical abstractions like a process or energy any more than we normally use such terms in thinking about ourselves. Nobody would think of saying these processes in relation to my body, which make for my personality, are hungry. One would simply say, I am hungry. Similarly, one should not address one's neighbors in terms of all the processes with which make him the person that he is. One would address him simply as you. Therefore, we address God as a thou. Okay, fine. Please explain the idea of a personal God. This is where I wanted to get to. The possibility of believing in a personal God depends on what one means by the term personal. Of course, we know enough about Kaplan after reading 4 answers that I think we would appreciate him answering in that fashion. Many people cannot believe in a God who is merely a magnified man, however subtle the substance of which such an anthropomorphic being is said to consist. Not only can not God be regarded as having corporeal attributes, he cannot even be viewed as thinking, feeling, or willing in any manner comparable to the way a man does. This is very much Maimonidean of him. Such ideas of God have long been condemned as idolatrous in accordance with the teachings of Rambam and other Jewish theologians in the Middle Ages. The real question is, does the belief that there is a God make any difference in our personal life? That's the real question. A God who makes a difference in one's personal life should be designated as a personal God. If we believe in God as the totality of the influences in the universe, which make for our becoming fully human, we must understand by personality that in us, in which all those influences are brought to focus. Personality, understood in that sense, and not merely in the sense of the sum total of our mental life, is the manifestation or revelation of the divine. God is thus personal to us, the very ground of our personality. In this sense, it is possible to believe in a personal God. All right, anybody find that answer meaningful on the personal God stuff? Stuart Pletcher?
Yeah, I up until now, I really didn't think of God as being personal to me. I think of God as many religious people would say, and they use the term very loosely, God is my life force. God is what breathed into my nostrils, and there's probably some remnant of that life force in me. And I was talking earlier about Martin Amis and science, and that type of thing. And the fact of the matter is, like Amos, the more I learn of science, the more I learn of the natural law, the more I tend to think God exists and God is present. And let me say why. We now know, I think it's 95% of the universe consists of black matter and black energy. And no one has a clue what that 95% is. So if no one else has a clue, I could come up with speculation as easily as anyone else and say, that's everything that ever existed. Nothing disappears according to science. And it's clear, nothing disappears. So to answer your question, for me, just for me, what does prayer do? Well, prayer connects me with the black matter that's coursing through every cell in my body, and it connects me with what I would call my life being, my creator. And to follow up on what Marcia said, I agree with her. I don't think God's involved in, determining, when I'm going to slip and fall and when I'm going to eat or when I'm going to starve. I don't think that. But I do think God is as present as 95% of the universe.
Thank you. That which is unseen. Thank you, Stuart. Nobody. I mean, so we love Heschel, right? Heschel, Kaplan, different points of view. Heschel believed that God sort of cries with us, like God cares about our individual decisions, cares. The prophet, God is in search of mankind. This process, it feels like it's an algorithm. It feels like I'm praying to an algorithm here. Can we find the best code, the best algorithm that will maximize human flourishing and fulfillment? And can we pray to that? For me, I do find it emotionally unsatisfactory. Now, that might not be intellectually consistent or intellectually honest, but so what? But so what? I mean, I'm not smart enough to be intellectually consistent or intellectually honest anyway. So, I mean, I'm willing to go along with the fact that there is additional wisdom that I don't have privy to. But I mean, when we pray, do anybody here, when you pray to God, do you think God's listening? I mean, we say, Shema Yisrael Adonai Eloheinu Adonai Echad. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one, right? We want to listen to God. Don't we imagine that God hears us and cares about us, has pathos for human beings? That really seems very absent here in a lot of Kaplan. And I do think that that's perhaps one of the reasons that his movement has never taken off. I think it is for the most. Oh, look at Ben Shin. He doesn't like that.
How can you say it hasn't taken off? It's inspired and influenced basically every stream of liberal Judaism.
How many Reconstructionist Jews do you meet? I mean, we don't. If you ask people to define themselves as Reconstructionist,
too well, and you don't need to be a Reconstructionist Jew to live in Kaplan's world. You can walk into any liberal synagogue in America
and be Kaplanian
and be. I mean, I was a member of SAJ. Their service doesn't look that different from ours.
Not at all.
They say a few different words in a few different places. But I think if you looked at those two different services, if you polled the people sitting in the pews, right, I think they'd have a lot of the same attitudes and beliefs and thinking about Judaism. And I think a lot of that goes back to Kaplan. I think the movement I think its failure is that it's been too successful. It no,
I like it.
it no
It's been
longer
too successful.
represents, it no longer represents a niche,
Okay. All right. I guess what I was trying to say is that Heschel is much more of a compelling narrative to give people. It makes
he
people
sounds better when you
It
quote him
makes
on the
people cry. It makes people feel. It opens up people's hearts. It brings them together. This sort of algorithmic faith is not, doesn't seem like that it's going to have the pull of drawing human beings together. So,
well, I would say that we preach in the poetry of Heschel, but we live our lives as Jews in the prose of Kaplan.
all right, I like that. That's very nice. We preach in the poetry of Heschel. Yes, for sure that's true. But we live our lives in the prose of Kaplan. All right, I like that. We should use that as a motto, perhaps, for the synagogue. Because I do think in a lot of ways we keep a lot of the prose that Kaplan has in terms of pluralistic notions of Judaism, in terms of cultural significance, in terms of athletic significance, in terms of just all the different elements of what it means to be a Jew, food, civilization. That's very much a part of our community. But I do think we want to retain the right to preach in Heschel. And ultimately, that's why it's sad that the two of them couldn't sit in the same movement. And I think that is the great challenge of the conservative movement, is to be able to hold both the poetry and the prose of Kaplan together, whether or not it's intellectually consistent, because perhaps that makes up two sides of what it means to be a human being.
Let's not forget they taught in the same seminary.
They did, but eventually had to leave. I mean,
yeah, but they did teach in the same seminary. So there's some umbrella, connecting the two.
Amen. And it should be rebuilt again today for the similar umbrella. That's what I think. We should have the Kaplans and the Heschels. We should have them together and to be in dialogue. I think the world is harmed by everyone going off into their bubbles and reading only their own stuff. So I really cherish everyone continues to engage in this, deep, challenging, philosophical lunch and learn that we continue to do as we continue to search for meaning and find ways to connect to God, however we come to define God here going into 2020. And we're not going to have Thanksgiving this year, and into 2021 and whatever the world has in store for all of us. So I just want to wish you all, it's 1 o'clock. So I hope you enjoyed your lunch break. Come back next week. We'll be here the day before Thanksgiving. I'm thinking about, I want to find something good about American and Thanksgiving and Jews. So I think maybe we'll talk about that next week. And if you want to study the Torah portion, tomorrow morning at 7:30 is Parsha and prayer. So we have prayer followed by a Torah study with me. So we're going to be talking about the Torah portion tomorrow morning, beginning at 7:30. Have a good rest of the day, everybody. Good to see you. Take care.
Yes,
Thank you.
Talk to you.
Thank you.